So they have to pay them in dollars every month. Well, yeah, okay, that works. Huh? They want to take over the South Korean foreign exchange. Well, how do the South Koreans feel about that? Yeah. Ouch. He could have warned me. Thanks. Yeah, see it. March 17th, 1952. You're in a foreign nation with your armies. It's an allied nation, and you rely on them to give you local currency to buy all the stuff you gotta buy there. But if that country doesn't have all that much currency in circulation, they have to print more. Many times more. And you know what the result of that is? Inflation, anger, and mistrust. Welcome to South Korea. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week, the Chinese radio broadcast more allegations that the UN forces were conducting biological warfare. The Panmunjom Peace talks continued, as always, and continue to bog down over POW issues and supervising an armistice. South Korean President Syngman Rhee is against any armistice that doesn't unite Korea under him, and US President Harry Truman threatened him with the loss of American assistance. The war in the field was quiet, as it mostly has been this year so far. I am aware that there are those of you out there who find the lack of action in the field and the focus on events behind the scenes not exceptionally interesting, perhaps even boring. But boring or not, it is necessary to understand the war. Military affairs were but one aspect of the problem of conducting the war on the soil of an ally. As the United States had discovered during the World War II campaigns in China, politics played an important role that seemed to increase in inverse ratio to the pressures generated at the front. If the fighting were heavy and external crises dominated the scene, internal politics might be played down or overshadowed. But a static war permitted domestic dissensions to come to the surface and frequently required delicate and diplomatic handling. The situation in South Korea followed this pattern and was to occasion many a tense moment for the UN command in its efforts to fight a war and conduct a peace at the same time. I'd like to look at the South Korean economy for a minute now. After World War II, until this war began, the US made large contributions to the South Korean economy. And once the war began, it was the US that took the lead in sending both economic and military aid. Sending things like food and medicine is not, I should point out, entirely from humanitarian motives. Public unrest or disease outbreaks within the area of UN command would mess with any military operations. It's that simple. But the US has long-range goals as well, to rebuild and rehabilitate the South post-war. On December 1st, 1950, based on an American proposal, the United Nations Korean Reconstruction Agency was formed, UNCRA. Most of its funding comes from the US. The war not ending has prevented it from fully functioning. But as 1951 got going, UN Command set up the UN Civil Assistance Command in Korea, UNCAC, to combat disease and public unrest. This was designed to safeguard rear areas and provide consumer goods for the immediate needs of the local population. By the end of 1951, UNCRA, though, was also already doing limited work reconstructing the South because of the static nature of the war. So relief and economic assistance now really are all under UN control. This gives UN Commander Matt Ridgway good leverage in negotiations. However, pouring loads of American money, services, and goods into Korea has kind of led to what the US experienced in China during World War II. The undeveloped South Korean economy, which is not only basically agricultural but has been disrupted by the war, has not been able to absorb the added purchasing power that large military expenditures brought into being. The South Korean government printed loads more money to meet the demands for more currency to facilitate military operations. But then it's not able to siphon off from that growing supply of cash in circulation by increasing industrial production or by larger imports of consumer goods. So inflation boomed already from the start of the war, and by January this year, the financial situation was dire. Now, way back in July 1950, the South Korean government promised to supply the UN the actual currency to use in Korea. They've been advancing Korean won to cover UN military requirements, but have lately been charging that the UN has not settled in dollars for the won issued, and that after January this year, they would not be able to provide more currency. This, of course, has really disturbed Ridgway, that the South Koreans might not meet their obligations. He doesn't have any problem with making monthly dollar payments for won, as long as the UN has some control over the foreign exchange. The South Koreans do have a problem with not controlling their own foreign exchange, however, and talks on this broke down last month. This is bad. Ridgway has told U.S. 8th Army Commander Jim Van Fleet to give his personal attention to holding down the spending of won. And in January, before things broke down, the UN did withdraw $8 million worth of won, up from the 6 in December to have a bit of a reserve. But as of March 1st, there are now 812 billion won in circulation, which is 6.5 times the 122 billion in circulation at the beginning of July 1951, just 8 months ago. So, with inflation going up and up, an impasse in financial negotiations, and Rhee's uncooperative attitude towards any armistice, Ridgway and U.S. Ambassador to South Korea John Muccio now suggest that a high-level mission go to South Korea from Washington specifically to sort out UN ROK relations. ROK is South Korea. The U.S. State, Defense, and Army departments all agree to do this, and they have started to prepare for it, and I will keep you posted on what develops. While there is no major action in the field this week, there is movement, at least, that is about to become major. Today, the 17th, Operation Mixmaster begins. This is not a combat operation. Well, it's not supposed to be a combat operation. The 1st Marine Division received orders from Lieutenant General James A. Van Fleet, commander of U.S. 8th Army, to leave the division's fortified perches along the western extension of the Taebaek mountain range in east-central Korea. Having won a well-deserved reputation for combat effectiveness during the first 18 months of the Korean War, the Marines now paid the penalty for that reputation by moving to a critical part of the Jamestown Line, the 8th Army's main line of resistance. Yep, the 1st Marine Division is taking responsibility for a 60-kilometer stretch of the front line that starts on the north bank of the Imjin River and runs over small ridges and streams until it reaches the west bank of the Samishon River. This is the far west of 8th Army's lines, under 1st Corps' control, and Van Fleet has been anxious about the Kimpo Peninsula defenses. The move is Operation Mixmaster and is to be completed by April 1st. I will talk more about it next week when it is in full swing. Speaking of talking, as I've discussed several times lately, the Panmunjom Peace talks have focused on how many ports of entry each side will be allowed to bring men and material into Korea through post-armistice, and what will be the composition of inspection teams to check out such men and material, which does mean check out classified stuff, or armistice compliance supervisory teams in general, with the U.S. very worried about the Soviets being part of such teams. Last week, I said that UN delegate at the talks Andrew Kinney was planning to tell the communist delegation that the UN would settle for 5 ports. The figure of 35,000 men per month was already agreed upon. 5 ports if the communists will give up detailed inspection. This week on the 15th, the communists quickly agree to this. Have they been using inspection as a bargaining chip? I don't know, but I do know that the matter of troop rotation post-armistice is now settled. I also went over a couple of possible ultimata last week. 2 scenarios by which the UN might issue an ultimatum and get an armistice fairly quickly. Matt Ridgway does not think the time is right for an ultimatum, though. This was Ridgway vis-a-vis the UNC delegation, acting as a moderate influence and tempering the bolder and riskier proposals emanating from Panmunjom. On the other side of the coin was Ridgway, the theater commander, versus the Washington policymakers. Here was the more aggressive leader, urging the adoption of a determined plan of action that would make the enemy realize that the UN command would grant no more concessions. He does write to the Joint Chiefs of Staff early this week on the 11th and tells them very plainly, neither he nor his staff know whether the communists actually want an armistice or not, nor how they feel about current issues. They are quite clearly becoming ever more aggressive and stubborn at the Panmunjom negotiating table, and the UN position does seem to be deteriorating somewhat. Maybe put a stop to this? That could be done by either force, which seems out of the question just now, or making a very firm and very public stand, backed not only by Washington, but by as many of the other UN nations fighting in Korea as possible. As usual, there is dithering and more dithering in Washington. Army staff officers there think firming up the Panmunjom front a great idea, but Army Operations, G3, wonders how advisable it is to approach each issue one at a time. That's Clyde Edelman, and he tells Army Chief of Staff Lightning Joe Collins it would hit harder if everything still unresolved was presented as a unified package. Okay, who supports this? Collins does, so does Secretary of State Dean Acheson, the President, even the Secretary of Defense. So, what exactly do they propose? Before a single package could be fashioned, they wanted the issues reduced to the absolute minimum. Then, when an impasse developed at the sub-delegation level and Ridgway was prepared to segregate and reclassify the non-repatriate prisoners, the UN commander would have the plenary conference assembled. Joy would deliver a letter urging a personal meeting of the commanders. If the communists agreed, Ridgway would present the package on an all-or-nothing basis. The UN command would concede on airfields, and the communists would be expected to give in on forcible repatriation and the Soviet Union. Although there would be no substantial debate, the liaison officers would remain available, and the UNC delegates would be willing to meet to explain their proposal. Joy is UN Chief Delegate Turner Joy. But wait. This is just about the same proposal Ridgway turned down literally last week from Turner Joy. And I imagine he must be stunned to receive something he likes even less from his superiors. Well, I don't imagine this. I know this because he protests very loudly. Do the communist delegates even have the authority to call for a meeting of field commanders? Ridgway doubts that very much. And that doesn't even take into account administrative delays, which calling for such a meeting would cause. And let me get this straight. He's to ask the other side to concede on 2 issues, but they shall only concede on 1? Is that right? And once again, with the segregating and reclassifying of POWs, he's been against this from the start, since it might imperil the lives of UN prisoners held by the enemy. Ridgway's recommendations remain unchanged. The first thing they should do is get rid of the Soviet Union supervisory inspection thing. Whether an armistice supervisory team is neutral or partisan, the Soviets should not be part of it and have inspection access to American stuff in any way, shape, or form. And then after that, they can worry about putting together some sort of package deal. Both civilian and military leaders in Washington are willing to meet some of Ridgway's objections. He doesn't want to talk to communist field commanders? Okay, then a plenary session at Panmunjom will do. They had just been thinking that if Ridgway himself was there, it would underline how serious their proposal was. And although they had seen no indication of an early solution to the USSR issue, they would be happy to have this solved before the package was offered. The essential factor here, they reminded Ridgway, was not Russian participation on the Supervisory Commission, but designation of the Soviet Union as a neutral nation. A compromise that avoided the latter would be perfectly acceptable. Neutral does not mean neutral like Sweden, by the way. It just means neutral with respect to this war. Here is what Washington flatly now says. They do not want any ultimatum, real or implied, delivered with any package proposal. Since they have no intention of large-scale military actions to back up such an ultimatum, it would be an empty threat, and a public empty threat. Also, if the negotiations break down over a package deal, blame for that must fall on the communists. It is somewhat refreshing to actually get a frank admission that they have no intention of making what would be idle threats. I mean, what would do more damage to the UN cause than have a huge bluff called by the communists? It looks like any suggestion of ultimatum by anyone is no longer welcome. Back to the segregating and classifying of POWs thing. Remember, Ridgway was actually given permission to remove POWs who might violently resist being sent to China or North Korea because of consequences they might face there from the POW lists if he wants. With this in mind, he has the idea that should he try to secretly screen the prisoners they have to see who's who, if that should come to light, it might imperil UN prisoners held by the enemy. But what if they did an overt screening? Like, what if they try to eliminate everyone who might violently resist repatriation through screening, but tell the communists very obviously they are going to do an overt screening? Maybe the other side would actually go for this. The powers that be are skeptical, feeling the communists might try to revise the list of prisoners they hold downward if the UN trims its rosters. On the contrary, Ridgway rebutted, the enemy would never accept a fait accompli brought about by secret and unilateral action. Only by allaying the communist suspicion of UNC double-dealing could the United Nations Command protect itself against retaliatory measures. He and his staff thought the enemy might agree to a trial screening. Speaking of prisoners, there's violent events this week at the UN's Kojido POW camp, where there was a bloody uprising last month. What happens now is between communist and anti-communist prisoners. On the 13th, an anti-communist detail passes a communist compound, and the communists throw stones at the detail and its ROK guards. The guards fire their guns back in return, without orders. Before things can be brought under control, 12 prisoners are dead, 26 more are wounded, and one U.S. officer and an ROK civilian who tried to stop the shooting are also wounded. And here are a couple of notes to end the week. On the 11th, UN planes hit a military complex near Sinmac and dropped nearly 125,000 liters, 33,000 gallons, of napalm. This is the largest napalm raid of the war so far. On the 15th, President Truman has the military responsibility for Taiwan and the Philippines transferred from Ridgway's Far East Command over to Pacific Command. Naval Task Force 72 comes under jurisdiction of the Pacific Fleet. And the week ends with more POW unrest, the Marines beginning to head west en masse, ever more plans for how to get an armistice, and the South Korean economy in shambles. At least the troop rotation issue post-armistice has been settled. That's one more thing. But as Ridgway wonders, does the enemy even really want an armistice? They are, as we've seen, building up. And they seem happy to throw their money at North Korea. And we know that the UN nations are getting ever more unhappy about throwing theirs at South Korea. And now its economy is a shambles. And the POWs keep rioting. Maybe playing the ever-waiting game is the right angle. And maybe they really can outlast the American willpower to keep its pockets open for Korea. Hey, here's a side thing. Many of you may remember me covering World War I week by week, like this war, in the series The Great War. And in my capacity as scholar of the Great War, I am doing something in June that might interest you. Tuesday, June the 9th at noon Eastern Time in the States, or 6 p.m. Central European Time, I'm doing an online lecture for the Smithsonian Associates on Russia's 1916 Brusilov offensive. There is a link below for information and tickets, right? As for this channel, it is the Time Ghost Army that makes it possible. Walter Reimer is the Army Member of the Week here. You can join the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.